Hello, James Bogue here. Welcome to the Yoga Top 40. This episode's entry into the chart is a single by Radiohead, Street Spirit, from the album The Bends, if I recall correctly. And I also recall when I first heard this song, it was on BBC Radio 1, and it was an evening program. I remember the DJs, the commentators saying, "Oh no, they've released an album track. This isn't a single material," but it turned out to be a very good single material. It was one of their best-selling singles of that period, I understand. Street Spirit. Now I'm here recording this in Mysore, South India, and I had a conversation with one of my neighbours the other day. One of his friends went to work in England, in the UK where I was born, and said to him he was just shocked how he would walk through the streets and not see anybody because the people stayed shut inside their homes. And I've lived in various countries and travelled quite a lot with work, and it's one thing that I've really enjoyed and appreciated in countries other than the place I grew up in England, where people live on the streets much more. They live outside much more. And so it creates this kind of vibrant interaction. And it helps us see some of the realities of life, which I think can actually reinforce us against some of the, I would say, potentially debilitating and crippling influences of the media. Some people have said, that we live these increasingly isolated and atomized lives. Many of my friends from countries that used to be in the so-called Eastern Bloc in Europe, in communist Europe, we've had conversations talking about why on earth in a residential apartment with 100 units do we have to have 100 internet routers? And why does every house have to have a toolbox with a toolkit, It would be so much more efficient if we would just share these things. I also recall when I lived in Thailand, I taught at a university called Chulalongkorn University, and in the Faculty of Arts. And the Faculty of Arts still has some of the original, very beautiful buildings from when the university was first constructed. I don't know exactly how many years ago, but close to a century ago, maybe more. But when I taught at the Faculty of Arts, it would be very rare that I would be working in those old buildings. Occasionally there would be some special class or some special event that we would use those spaces for, and there were certain offices in there. And the library was in there. But the main teaching building was a 15-floor building. And one of my colleagues from the neighbouring Faculty of Fine and Applied Arts, who's a dance teacher, he had studied architecture at that same university at the time when they started to build on campus these multi-storey buildings. And I remember one time him recounting to me how his architecture teacher had said, "This is the death of the university when we start to have these multi-storey buildings." Because university, what does it really mean? It's a universal education, so we should all be learning and growing and exploring together. So my colleague's teacher, this architecture professor, had said, when you all live on the same level, when everything's on the ground level, the cross-fertilization, the interaction, and just the exposure to different trends, different ideas, different ways of thinking, different ways of examining and exploring and inquiring, then the cross-fertilization, the mutual nourishment, it just happens in a very easeful, organic way. But once you start to be, one floor is this department, one floor is that department, then the interaction is so vastly reduced, sometimes almost to zero. And so he said this was the death of university. the death of a real university education, when there's no longer that intermingling between different groups, different faculties, different departments. And I think there's a lot of truth in this. And I think it also it can tell us something about the way that we often live in apartments, in tower blocks, or just in bungalows or two-story houses in a neighborhood in which people don't really live outside. And I would say that the street spirit, or the spirit of the old-style university campus where everything's on the same level, the street spirit where people are just out sharing, this spirit can really help us in terms of cultivating greater harmony in our lives. Sometimes people say, and I've probably said it as well, that you have to be very careful when you expose yourself to the news. Traveling and living in different cultures, I've had enough lived experiences to know that the news always, always, always paints a very partial picture of a situation. It is not truth, it's not the whole truth. It could be some aspect of the truth. It's not really, people say, oh, you need to watch the news to stay informed. Of course, there's something to be said for that. But watching the news is not going to keep you informed. It's going to keep you informed as to what is being broadcast in the news. But I've been in places where there have been war zones, or where there have been coups, and then seen the way that those things get reported on the BBC or on some international news channel. It's like, that's so far from what's really going on here. I remember when I was a teenager being at the Notting Hill Carnival one year in London, and had a very relaxed day, nothing untoward experienced at all. But on the news, there was this story of this terrible riot and all this violence, and this had been just some tiny little pocket in this much bigger situation of lots of people having, a very peaceful time, no problems at all. But the news presented it in this very skewed way. So if we live in a little atomized, isolated apartment compartment, and we are bombarded with these very partial representations of what's going on in the world, I think it can be easy to be misled, to become a little bit down about the true nature of reality, which is always mixed. There's always lots of fantastic things happening. Humans are on a daily basis doing wonderful things. But the news doesn't really present that to us. So having been, let's say, a traveller, and having lived in lots of different countries since I was relatively young, I've always had this idea, well, no, never mind watching the news and the TV, actually make the news. Go out into the reality of the world and interact. Be open, be present, and so much interesting beauty is all around. And this spirit, I've been fortunate to be among people whose culture still involves much more outdoor living, much more sharing, much more talking to the neighbours, interacting with the strangers who pass, so they're no longer so strange. I think this can be a really, really useful practice. And some people report that when they travel, when they are anonymous and unknown, and especially if they travel alone, they have these beautiful experiences where they meet lots of very interesting people who surprise them, people who share things that move them, people from cultures that they thought they were different from, who share so many of the same deep impulses, desires and challenges. And so this idea of street spirit and connecting to that which is around us, I think this is a really intrinsic part of yoga practice. Yoga means integrating, balancing, harmonizing. And if we want to integrate, we have to include. And when we become atomized and isolated, it's very easy to get kind of trapped in our own little bubble that isn't even an accurate picture of ourselves. Because I think once we step out into the new, into the unknown, into a place where we can have a surprising interaction, an interaction that might show us something different, this can actually connect us more to the true spirit of life and existence, which is full of creative potential and is not limited by human ideas or beliefs. So, street spirit, get out, step outside that atomization. And if we live in a place, like for example, I've visited places in the UK and in the United States where this atomization is quite overt. You're out on this, people kind of, they don't really, you walk through a neighborhood and you see the glow of the TV in the window. You don't see people outside on the step or in the garden chatting with the neighbors, people passing by. I've also lived in places where that's very different, where kids are playing on the street, the guys have gathered there chatting, someone comes by, they chat, and I think there's a lot to be said for this. So my friend, when he said, his friend who worked in England was just amazed at how quiet it was. Where's the life? And I have other friends who, come from Asia and Africa to work in some parts of Europe or the US, who, again, they also find this quite strange. And even though I was born in England, I also find it a little strange. That when I grew, where I grew up at the time, it was not uncommon for there to be 30, 40 kids from the neighborhood playing on the street. But now when I visit the UK, I don't see anything near as much of that. And so I think it's maybe true that there have been many forces that have been encouraging this greater isolation, atomization, and a withdrawal from the reality of nature, a disconnection from the elements. And so I would think, get out in the street, get out in the fields, get out in the hills, get out by the water, by the ocean, get outside and speak to people, interact with people. Here in India, several years ago I was invited to a conference in Nagpur, this city in the center of India, and the keynote speaker was Dr. B.M. Hegde, very interesting man, trained as a physician, but has also worked at Harvard University and the CERN space research, or the particle research place in Switzerland. A very, very interesting man, great speaker, and he said, if you want to be healthy, get outside, move, walk barefoot if you possibly can, talk to your neighbors, laugh, smile, look at the sky, eat real food. He said, and the thing you don't want to do ever is go and get a health checkup. Because he said, they will plot your results onto some so-called standard graph. And for him, the reasoning behind that didn't make sense as a physician. He said, according to that reasoning, somebody who is in the 95th percentile of height, well, okay, we better chop your legs off to make you fit within the normal range. Or somebody who's very short, we better put you on the rack. Obviously, this is not real. Human beings are very different. What is a state of balance and homeostasis for one person might not be for somebody else. So this doctor, he suggested, rather than go to some diagnostic center, of course those things can be useful, but if you feel fine, don't do it. Because sometimes your body will be dealing with things quite fine, but if you go and do some investigation, you might get some news which, once it enters your mind, creates all sorts of problems. Of course, if you're having difficulties, for sure, go and get checked out. But if you're feeling okay, he says, don't go to the health check. Just go outside, talk to other people, walk barefoot on the earth, move, get some exercise every day, eat real food, drink clean water. Bus. This is enough. This is the simple recipe for health. But very important, get outside, connect with the elements and connect with other people. And so street spirit, I think we could do to cultivate more of this communal shared ethos, that when we're all living, to recognize that we're all in this together and to share the streets and the soil of our earth in a way that recognizes we all do depend on each other inhabiting this space in a respectful way. Thank you.